It's now my pleasure to introduce a new friend, Dr. Rochelle Scheuermann, and she's Associate Professor of Evangelism and Leadership at Wheaton College Graduate School, where she directs the Doctor of Ministry program and serves as a department chair. Importantly for this conversation, she's a mother of a son with Down syndrome and is especially eager to help with the church in developing a robust theology of disability and ministry so that people with disabilities are not only welcomed into the church, but are included in the work and witness of the church as essential members. And I could say a lot of things, but the reason she's here is because I found she was working on some really creative ways in developing what I had done in disabling, mission-enabling witness, bringing in some new conversation partners and orienting more specifically toward the practice of evangelism. So with no more introduction, here is Rochelle.
Good morning. It's so good to be with you here in Mulder Chapel, as well as those of you that are attending on our online session. For my PowerPoint slides, I have tried to depict what I'm saying both in image as well as trying to capture a few key quotes. And those of you that have access to the PowerPoint, the alt text is enabled for you in that. So it was in adopting our son with Down syndrome that has been one of the greatest blessings of my life for my husband and me. But it was also that space where I found myself entering the disability world and realizing that the church's response had been pretty lacking. I still remember exactly where I was when a very well-meaning lady came up to me. I was at a women's Christmas event, and I was putting some food on my plate, and she's like, I had to find you. I had like the most amazing thought. I was like, sure. And she says, we were at a church service, and we were praying for God to heal a child of autism. And I thought, oh, if God heals your son, do you think he would change his physical features too? Now, it was the first time that someone had blatantly said this to me. I was crushed, I was angry, I was confused, I was flustered, and I wasn't sure what he needed to be healed from or what it was about his physical features that seemed to be so problematic for her. But her question haunted me because not long after this, I began teaching my next apologetics class. And student after student kept telling the gospel story the same way. The world God created was perfect. Human beings messed it up with sin. And now we deal with brokenness, sickness, disease, death. Now, Jesus' death and resurrection resolved what we couldn't. And someday the fullness of God's kingdom will come where humans will get back their perfect bodies and will enjoy a perfectly new heaven and earth. And suddenly a paradigm that I hadn't found problematic before became deeply problematic. Was this really good news for my son? I began asking questions like, well, is it true that the only reason my son was born with an extra chromosome was because Adam and Eve ate the fruit? How do I reconcile this with the notion that God says we are fearfully and wonderfully made, that he formed us in the womb? If my son's extra chromosome is the result of sin coming into the world and distorting creation, does this mean that new creation requires that extra chromosome to be eliminated? Does it mean that the very things that make him are the very things that God will reject in new creation? Now, if these are the questions I started asking after already believing in Jesus, following Jesus, being passionate about Jesus, I began wondering, how would telling this story this way help those outside of the church, particularly those with disabilities and their families, want to actually join in the journey? Now, let's see if is it working? Now it's working. All right. Eric Carter's recent research suggests that in the last month, 59% of people with disabilities did not attend a religious service. Now, if you consider that 27% of people in the U.S. alone have a disability, and that having a disability, particularly if it is an intellectual or a developmental disability, is a reliable predictor of whether people and their families are present in the church, then we can take that 59% and we can expand it vastly to say that there are a lot of people who are not in the church. People with disabilities and their families are not being reached. And when they are, the church really isn't doing a great job of actually incorporating them into the body as full-fledged, contributing, leading, participating members. And so this really has led me toward my current research and writing emphasis as I'm trying to speak into this space by examining again what God's story really is, to ask where does disability show up in God's story so that we can then consider how is it that we incorporate people with disabilities in the evangelism and mission and work of the church as recipients, as participants, and as leaders. This is obviously too much for a 1-hour symposium, so you'll have to get the book when it's done. But for today, what I really want to do is carefully consider where and how disability fits within God's mission so that everyone can embrace the good news story as something that is truly good news for them. And in doing so, I really hope to share the implications for how we can then share God's story and live God's story in disabled ways. So first, let's consider God's story and examine this question: where does disability show up? It's a big question. It's a question a lot of people try to answer. And so let me do a brief refresher about God's story to make sure we're all on the same page. It is not, as many of my students try to tell me, that simply Jesus died so we can go to heaven. It really is a full Bible, Genesis to Revelation, eternity to eternity story that, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to just divide into 4 acts. Now, in this first act, creation, we are introduced to the main characters of God's drama. We start with the God over all gods who is unlike any other God, who is powerful and good, and who creates everything that exists as a good extension of himself. He creates for his own pleasure, by his own power, for his own purposes. And every creative act is seen as good until God gets to day 6. And on this day, he forms man and woman and invests his very image in them through his own life-giving breath. This creative climax results in the pronouncement of very good. And the week ends on day 7 with God resting from his work. Now, sadly, as we know, Satan comes rushing in to disrupt the peace. This whole garden is before Adam and Eve, and there only one tree holds limits. But Satan makes them question God by suggesting God's withholding something from them. He's withholding power. And this leads Adam and Eve to view limitation as something bad. They did not need to eat the fruit to become like God. They had already been made in God's image, and they were already an imprint of God in the world. But somehow that truth doesn't prevail. It is limitation that becomes the concern. And with that, Eve reaches out, she takes, and she eats. Adam reaches out, he takes, he eats. And both immediately hide themselves in shame. And now we know that the consequences of this terrible act are swift and are broad. God had created with the intent that everything in creation would experience a shalom, a peace that was all-consuming. And it's not, as we think today, merely this idea of absence of war, but it was more about a fullness of life, harmony, things as it should be. But the choice Adam and Eve makes mars all of this. In doubting God's word, they introduce distrust and disharmony into the world, so that the very things God had imprinted his very good creation to do, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, care for creation, they're now complicated by difficulty, dismay, disruption, and death. But the amazing thing is that this story isn't all bad news on this fateful day. In the midst of God revealing the consequences of sin, God inaugurates this third act, redemption. And what he announces this day is an ultimate solution, but not an immediate one. One day, he says, Eve's seed will crush the serpent. Generations and generations pass, millennia, until one day, as promised, God determines the time is right. And he enters his world as a fully God, fully human being. And in Jesus, God comes to break sin, to restore lives, to bring justice, to enable flourishing. And he does this by taking on the world's sins and the consequences of the world's sins by willingly dying on the cross. His death, however, is not an end. It really is a beginning. And as predicted, he rises from the dead 3 days later, forever breaking the power of sin and our enslavement to its consequences. And he begins writing a new future, a new creation in which God's judgments will deal the final blow to Satan, sin, and death. And God's life will sustain his new people called out from every tribe, nation, language, and tongue. And in this new future, God finds his home among his people, and his presence forever dissolves death, sorrow, crying, and pain as he makes all things new. Now, God's creation to fall to redemption to new creation story is grand and a wonderful story. But that's not always how we tell it. Here's how many Christians I know tell this story. The world as we see it is not what God intended. The world God created was perfect, and it didn't have any sickness or disability or brokenness in it. Sadly, our sin messed it up, and all of the suffering and evil and disease that we see is a result of sin. But there's good news. Jesus died, he rose again, and God will someday make it right, where we're going to get back to this perfect Eden in heaven, where we will have perfect bodies, and there won't be any suffering or evil. Now, we hit on some of the points, but we also unintentionally emphasize other points that aren't fully in the text. To the point that when I or someone else asks, well, then where does disability show up in this story? Even if we're afraid to actually vocalize this out loud, our minds inevitably respond, the fall. But I want to go back and consider this rendition of God's story piece by piece, the way we normally tell it. When talking with our friend or neighbor, we actually start the story in the fall. What we see is not what God intended. Then we back up the story to emphasize the perfection of creation, that Eden offers us a sublimely peaceful, perfectly ordered, perfectly functioning world where perfect bodies are put to work and where people housed in these bodies live at peace with one another. Then we start forward again, showing how sin destroyed perfection, prevented us from fixing it, required this perfect sacrifice, Jesus, to reclaim it. And then we end by exulting in a restored perfection where sin will no longer have reach. Now, what do we notice about this telling? First, this story actually starts in the fall. When we look at the world in front of us, what we see is broken. And it's broken because of sin. But second, Second, to remedy our brokenness, we tell the beginning and the end of the story in a way that actually emphasizes perfection. It is perfection that we see as being God's supreme act in creation, and it is perfection that becomes the ultimate reward in the end. And the third thing this story does is that it seems to emphasize humans. Yes, we think God creates, God redeems, God rewards, but we make the real focus of this story about us, our perfection, our brokenness, and our hope for perfection once again. And somewhere in there, we lose the fact that this is God's story. And everything about it should relate to his purposes, his actions, and his holy and holy other existence, power, and glory. Now, while on premise it is true that we lose Eden when we sin, that sin does break things in this world, and that God, through Jesus Christ, will soon usher in a new heaven and earth, what this narrative does when unexamined and told this way is actually push us toward ideals and language that problematizes rather than privileging people with disabilities. So let's consider this first example. And the reason for God, Tim Keller, and I absolutely love Tim Keller, but he says this: disease, genetic disorders, famine, natural disasters, aging, and death itself are as much the result of sin as are oppression, war, crime, and violence. Now, as a mom of a kid with a genetic disability, I am struggling to see how an extra 21st chromosome is of the same substance as war, violence, and oppression. Why does the presence of that extra chromosome inherently locate my son's life in the fall? Now, what Keller is trying to do is to explain that sin broke the perfectly working systems in the world, from people to nature to relationships. But what his wording assumes is a medical model of disability by believing that somehow an extra chromosome is simply a body problem that can be separated from the person in whom that extra chromosome exists. Let's consider the second example. Greg Boyd, in Is God to Blame, he makes this more explicit by arguing that because Satan tampers with God's good plan, God has no part in disabilities. For Boyd, Scripture unequivocally affirms that infirmities such as muteness or blindness originate from Satan. And God's role is to empower human mediators to free people from these afflictions. Now, for both writers, disability really is seen as a byproduct of sin that is located in individual bodies, and as such, inherently results in suffering and affliction. Now, if what Keller and Boyd say is true, then of course we would want to free individual people from sin and the consequences of sin that distort God's intended plan for the human body and from the inherent suffering that disability brings. And this is the kind of thinking that is very prevalent in the church. It assumes that disability can be neatly carved away from a person without any unintended consequences. But what we know is that disability doesn't have such easily delineated boundaries. Some disabilities are so constitutive of a person and their identity that when we assign disability squarely in the camp of sin and use this as our starting point, we cannot help but convey that the message that the person housing that disability also belongs in the sin camp as well. A fall-centered story leads us to fall-centered assumptions about disabled people, and thus fall-centered solutions that diminish much of the goodness of good news. Hear me clearly, people with disabilities are not more affected by sin than those who consider themselves able-bodied. All disability does not directly link to sin. Disability does not equate unequivocally to suffering and affliction or mean that people with disabilities who happen to show a measure of joy or contentment must necessarily have these in abundant quality because, well, only a truly extraordinary person could still be happy when they suffer so much. Many people with disabilities do not seek healing for their disability, and when they do, it is often for a very nuanced aspect of their disability rather than everything in total. An impairment by default will not necessarily be eliminated in heaven. When we pull out these conjectures that lead us down that wrong path and we call them out as false, we are left with some key principles that are ready to find themselves located within God's story. First, people with disabilities are people. Perhaps that's too obvious of a statement, but the fact that too often people with disabilities are seen as everything but people makes this really necessary. Personhood matters. And even when the disability is a marker of pride, identity, and embodiment, we're still talking about people. Second, disability relates to people in a host of ways that make simplified answers impossible. We cannot make broad, sweeping generalizations about disabilities and assume that a single answer solves all of the complexities of disablement. And third, disability involves bodies and environment, physical realms and social realms. And so encountering God's story necessarily requires that we address both. So with these 3 points in mind, let's return to our biblical narrative and consider what happens when we start where the text actually starts. In the beginning, God. The first act of the Bible actually starts with one actor who is outside of all time and creation, God. Though people end up factoring rather largely in the narrative that proceeds from God, the opening of the story reminds us that people and their bodies are not the beginning, the center, or the end. God is. And with this, we are forced to step out of the center and to then rethink the purpose and the impetus of the story. It is all about God and God's desire to create a world from which to draw glory and through which to display his glory. And I think this corrects our usual storyline that a perfect world and creation dominate the conversation. It is God who is central actor, character, power, and purpose of creation. And this understanding serves then as an anchor point for how we consider all of the subsequent acts within creation to new creation. One of the first things we notice as we move from God to God's first act, creation, is that the beginning surprisingly centers on limits. The moment that an unboundless God creates, what God creates necessarily has limits. And surprisingly, God calls these limits good. Brian Brock contrasts the formlessness of Genesis 1:2 with the bounded distinctions of created things. And he suggests that to have embodied limits is a marvelous gift. When we recognize limits as being an unsurprising and intrinsic aspect of human existence, limits move from being a negative evil to something that Deborah Creamer says is good, or at the very least, not evil. And I think this corrects our storyline that emphasizes perfection as the pinnacle of creation, and that the ultimate goal of redemption is realized in the new eschaton as perfection. Rather than idealizing bodily perfection and visible beauty, the presentation of the goodness of limited creatures, Brock says, allows us to dwell on the beauty of our place within the ecology of God's working. And in this, Brock suggests that our shift toward the valuation of embodied limits introduces the idea of vulnerability into creation as another good, allowing us to then speak about creatures who have unfamiliar forms without reference to the fall. Second, within God's desire to create a world for his glory, we find the evaluation of extreme diversity. There is not one light in the sky, one type of terrain, one type of water. There is not one type of inhabitant within these spaces. Diversity just oozes forth in creative forms and functions that God speaks into existence and then empowers to continue developing. In fact, for God to be perfectly imaged and clearly on display, humans has to be formed as male and female. And the call of creation to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth also speaks to the diversity of God and the diversity that God desired through the natural expansion of genetic codes that cause each animal, plant, and person to be of its own kind and yet unique among its own kind. With bodily limits and diversity as a given of creation, we are moved to consider the physical and functional goodness of all types of bodies. But this in and of itself is not enough. We also need a theological accounting of the goodness of people's lives as they are. And I think this leads us to the final and perhaps most surprising thing we find in the creation account. God chooses to make people in his image and subsequently patterns them after himself. Now, our familiarity with this idea of imago Dei has probably anesthetized us to this fabulous nature of this assertion. But theologian Mark Cortez reminds us of the power of this declaration by noting, at the beginning of a work founded on the belief in an invisible God who cannot be depicted by images and who transcends human understanding, God declares his intent to image himself in finite, physical, and imperfect human beings. This is revolutionary, and for most theologians, central to how we actually understand human beings, in essence and in function. Now, there's no way to take a deep dive here, but in considering what Imago Dei means, let me note 4 things. First, the Imago Dei extends to all humans. There is not an intended quality, capacity, ability, or other characteristic that must be met in order for someone to be touched by the image of God. And as such, any view that disqualifies or calls into question some persons and not others is not a valid reading of the text. Second, imaging God is necessarily communal and interdependent. Third, any understanding of Imago Dei must necessarily start with the fact that Jesus Christ is the revelation of true humanity. Even as we understand ourselves as these mysterious beings who are both part of and unique within creation, we can never make us the starting place for understanding God's image. Jesus alone holds that position. And Jesus, as God's image, showcases this radically upside-down kingdom where suffering and service identify God's Son, where obedience is learned through suffering, and where Jesus also retains the scars and the marks of disability in his glorified, resurrected, and transformed body. Finally, Imago Dei doesn't just touch all of humanity. It also touches all of our humanity. Imaging God cannot be Gnostic. Our bodies matter immensely for how we image God in a physical world and through our relationships within that world. But these whole bodies that include mind, soul, flesh also experience brokenness because of sin. We can never fully or perfectly image God in the world because all of humanity and all of our humanity is also touched by sin. Now, if we take all of this then and go back to that question and we say, where does starting our understanding of disability, where the texts start, what does that do for how we understand and tell God's story? We're going to start seeing some shifts. First, in terms of creation, our understanding of God's design for this world will allow us to place some differences and limitations in mind, body, emotion, sociality, and function within creation. This doesn't mean that all disability is located pre-fall. Disability really is complex, and we cannot discount the ways in which sin integrates with bodies, minds, and relationships. But by starting with God creating, we can pull ourselves away from this usual anthropocentric view of disability that centers disability and people with these disabilities in the fall. When we start in creation, we keep the fall in perspective and limit its ability to undermine the "it was very good" of God's creation. And we limit then its ability to dictate the rest of the story in a person-word way. Diversity, limitation, calling, vocation, and imaging all flow out of God and God's purposes of and pleasures for creation. This then puts everyone on the same plane. There are not some humans who are better, more perfect, more ideally created. Rather, all humans are created by God with a variety of differences and a variety of limitations. And all humans are touched by God's image and given ways in which to image God in a world through relationship and representation. Second, in terms of fall, we're able to speak more circumspectly about it. Sin impacts every human life equally. The wages of sin is death, and the consequences of living in a sinful world lead to all sorts of calamities and challenges, from broken bodies to broken social spaces that problematize some bodies and minds over others. And the fall gives us space to make sense of the tragedies and complexities of life, to call sin sin, to name the ways that disability might relate to living in a fallen world. Sin can damage bodies in irreparable ways, And everybody's body, as I'm knowing more and more each day, will eventually present problems. But for all the fall can do, it can never overtake the start of the story that God created, and what God created is good. Because of this, no one is ever born as a tragedy of sin. All of us matter. No matter how we are embodied in the world, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Third, in terms of redemption, we get ourselves drawn away from the human-centric notion that redemption is all about getting us to heaven with perfected souls housed in perfect bodies. The first announcement of the gospel comes in Genesis. Through one of Eve's offspring, God is going to crush Satan, but note that this offspring would not triumph unscathed. Satan would bruise this offspring's heel so that the one who redeems the world would himself be marred by the world. We know this offspring is Jesus Christ, the true human who was fully God and fully man. And as the true human, Jesus experienced all of the same temptations we faced, though without sin. He was marked by humanness and sin, with his body experiencing the wear and tear of life and the crushing, bruising, and violence of sin as enacted upon him in his murder. And I think this is a really important point. Carmen Imes argues, if the ideal human is an able-bodied, virile male, then the aging process automatically erodes a man's humanness. But when we look at Jesus, we discover this can't be the case. Being human on this side of the garden, she says, entails frailty, weakness, and dependence. Jesus experienced these things in his aging body without losing an inch of his status or dignity. With his resurrection, Jesus deals that final blow to sin and opens the way for us to receive full life in him, and yet his resurrected body still carries the marks and the scars of this life and death forward in transformed and glorified ways. This tells us then that bodies matter both now and in the resurrection. Jesus is the firstborn of the dead, and because of how his body is retained and transformed in the resurrection, we can be confident of this fact that our bodies are not bad. But as Imes says again, we simply need to remove the sin that's spurred on by evil desires so that we can reflect God's glory to the world. God creates bodies and redeems bodies, but he never problematizes some bodies as being aberrant, worthless, or insignificant. Even the most egregious marks that come from another's sinful hand are no match for God's redemptive power. For Jesus and for us, our scars may not be erased, but they will be transformed, and we can be assured that our resurrection body will never die, will never disappoint us, will be full of glory and full of power. Which then leads us to new creation. When we understand disability from a creational aspect, we're no longer focused on the need for the elimination of problematic bodies in heaven and the creation of something utterly new. Rather, we can rejoice in the ways that God's redemptive power brings renewal, restoration, and healing to all of creation, so that we can fully live out God's creational intents for relationship, shalom, and vocation. New creation is not about finally realize these Hollywood idealized bodies that we don't even know what that's supposed to be, right? New creation will instead be about a new heaven and earth in which everyone participates in a redeemed creation, where diversity continues to reign. The ramifications of new creation will be cosmic, will include the eradication of prejudice, exclusion, and social alienation. It will be God's kingdom come and God's will be done, which again pulls humans out of the center and simply realigns us as members of God's family who are able to reclaim our roles as God's agents and image bearers over all of restored and renewed creation. So if the first creation does not exclude the goodness of all created humanity, nor demand the perfection of body or mind in order to take on the gifts of imaging God. How much more so is this true of new creation, in which disability is not eradicated, but rather, along with all parts of humanity, is transformed, glorified, and fitted into God's kingdom as a valuable and important part of this grand diversity of God's family, and as a part of how the diversity of God's works that God expects in his eternal shalom take place. Only within this new creation will humanity in all of its ethnic, cultural, social, gendered, and bodily difference do what it has been designed to do from the beginning: serve God by reigning as his ambassador. I don't know about you, but I'm like, this is good news, and it's actually good news for everyone. But in taking this all together, let's go back to our next question and ask, well, then how then can we speak and live a disabled gospel message in practical ways? This will only scratch the surface, and I hope will invite wonderful conversation. Sam Chan, in his book, Evangelism in a Skeptical World, he argues that anytime we make a gospel presentation, it should say something about who Jesus is, the individual and corporate blessings that come from this, and what our response must be. Now, it become easy then to lock into one way of telling the story and thinking that the way in which the gospel came to me is the way in which it should go to everyone. But this simply isn't so. Now, let me make one very clear statement here. The story of Jesus doesn't change, period. But there are many ways in which we can tell this story, and what we choose to emphasize within that story should very much depend on who is listening and what will connect with them. And over, Scripture paints so many different metaphors and ways of seeing Jesus, of seeing ourselves, and of finding the right response. This should give us comfort and freedom to, as Chan encourages, explore a variety of gospel presentations, looking for the one that will best connect with our audience, existentially, emotionally, and culturally. So what could this good news gospel story meaningfully say about the times when my son is so dysregulated that he's flailing on the parking lot and just can't be pulled out? What does it say about the times when his tenderness and his love radiate in ways that just seem otherworldly? What does the gospel give to families who face so many more challenges than we have, who are so much more exhausted than we are, which is sometimes hard to imagine? Following Chan's model, what I want to do is consider simply 4 starting points, remembering that these are just examples, and the ways in which you will enter a Jesus conversation can be vast and varied and really should be based on what the person in front of you is needing. So gospel number 1. I think back to the day when we adopted our son, the first hold, the first realization that he was ours. And I think back to many of the initial responses that people gave us when they heard that he had a disability. Oh, I'm so sorry. Poor kid. I guess that's why his birth parents gave him up and didn't want him. You are such extra special people for adopting him. People celebrated with us, but in these circumstances, there was this kind of underlying message of pity, of tragedy, of this dismissal of this little life as something that they didn't really see as valuable, desired, or even needed in the world. And what I wanted in those moments was a way to celebrate life in all of its embodied forms, even while recognizing the reality that we were heading into unknown challenges, both big and small. And what the gospel story gives us in these moments is a true reason to celebrate. There is an inherent goodness in being created, an evaluation of life in all of its embodied forms. God created us. God loved his creation so much that he gave his own son so that we could find eternal life through him. This disbands the assumption that disability evokes automatic pity. People are to be celebrated because God was at work in their creation, and he has given each one his image. This also adamantly counters the belief that some genetic potentialities that are discovered in utero are legitimate grounds for destroying that budding life, or that when those lives come to fruition, they can be viewed as dispensable. Even when our bodies present problems, we are fearfully and wonderfully made and should be honored as such. Everyone finds themselves in the creation story and subsequently in the rest of God's story too, which means that we don't have to assume a posture of grief and solemnity the moment that we hear a baby is born with a disability. It also means that when people develop a disability later, we do not suddenly see their lives as tragic and pitiable, even when the circumstances and the outcomes can indeed be tragic. Their lives are still to be celebrated because even in this, God is present and at work and manifesting himself through this life. In celebrating a life, it doesn't negate the real truth that some disabilities cause pain, concern, disappointment, anger, sadness. But it does mean that we can never discount that life out of turn simply because of a disability. Life is good because life is from God. And because life is from God, God loves that life so much that he does everything necessary for that life to experience the fullness of existence that can only come in following him. So God is creator. He made a way for us to experience eternal, full, complete, and fruitful life in him through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Our response is to embrace his life and surrender to his Spirit's transforming work. Gospel 2. What we see in our telling is that the gospel story doesn't just relish on the highs. The gospel story takes sin very seriously, and much of the Bible is spent actually recounting the innumerable ways in which sin steals, kills, and destroys. Every person is found guilty and wanting because of their collusion with sin and their disobedience of God. This disbands the assumption that people with disabilities are these holy innocents that lack culpability. People with disabilities need to hear this message. All have sinned, and the result has been destruction in every way imaginable. Things are falling apart. But for people with disabilities, not only do they just need to know of their own sin, but there will also be points at which an understanding of sin's consequences will help make sense of their own experiences of disability, particularly the points in which they experience pain, suffering, and heartache. And at those points in which exclusion, prejudice, and injustice make impairment something problematic. Excuse me. The good news is that God already had a plan in motion to deal with these vast consequences of sin before Adam and Eve ate the fruit. And through the work of Jesus Christ, God has dealt a cosmic blow to sin, rendering justice for all of our mistreatments of self, others, society, creation, erasing sin's punishment by giving forgiveness and life to all who call on his name, and restoring true shalom. Jesus is Redeemer. He has provided a cosmic solution to a cosmic problem, and our response is to repent. Gospel 3. In taking sin seriously, the gospel story also gives us means to face the pains, sorrows, difficulties, and injustices of life head on. Through his victory on the cross, God is bringing new heavens and earth and a renewal of mind and bodies. It's a work that has started, though, and it's not yet in its fullness. And in this space, we deal with pain, suffering, and grief, even as we hope for the future to come. And beautifully, God has given us the gift of lament for such a time as this. We don't often tell the gospel story and center it on lament, but the story gives us space to call out brokenness and injustice that we see, to rage at it, to throw our hurts and our frustrations and our anger at God, to name and condemn specific ways in which bodies and people and societies break down. The gospel doesn't offer pithy statements or easy solutions to this lament. Instead, the gospel story presents God as one who is concerned for our afflictions and moved by our trouble, so much so that he becomes Emmanuel, God with us, stepping into this world in a finite human body to take sin and destruction head on. The prophet Isaiah notes that Jesus was despised and rejected by humankind, a man of suffering and familiar with our pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. We considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. For many people with disabilities, this has been their own experience. Being despised and rejected, experiencing pain and suffering, held in low esteem, the one other people stare at or quickly avert their eyes from, accused of sin, and even getting what they deserve. The lament of disability includes physical and mental pain, but also the wounding of a world that considers different embodiment as something to be despised, condemned, rejected, and shunned. To this experience of disability comes Jesus, a man who embodies the very suffering, pain, rejection, and exclusion experienced daily by the disabled. He takes up everyone's pain, bears our suffering. He is physically marred and crushed for our transgressions and iniquities, and he takes on wounds by which we all find healing. When we sit with people with disabilities and their families, understanding this place of lament and the gospel's ability to name the wrongs should keep us from turning the Bible into motivational sound bites that ignore context and promote false positivity. Please do not tell people with disabilities that God gives his greatest challenges to his toughest soldiers, or that God will never give them more than they can handle. Please do not rush to Romans 8:28 without first stopping and sitting in the brokenness, frustration, and groaning of Romans 8, verses 18 to 27. Yes, God is at work, but not in a way that discounts how difficult everyday life can be. God's love remains, and we're never separated of it, even when we're walking through trouble, hardship, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, sword. So in your gospeling, sit with lament for as long as it takes. Name the hurts and the pains and the injustices. Consider the medical, financial, emotional, and relational toll of disability. And show how Jesus really does get it. Because he was called crazy. He was an embarrassment to his brothers. He was despised, rejected, accused, excluded, and marred. Jesus knows, and because he knows, he can also be near to the disabled in a way that only those who have experienced disability can. Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. By identifying with our greatest pains, sorrows, and griefs, he not only understands the disabled experience, he takes that experience to the cross in order to set things right. Our response is to let Jesus take up residence with us so we can walk the road with him. In Gospel 4, my grandmother was a wonderful, strong Christian lady who was about as twisted up as you could possibly get. Early onset rheumatoid had just made a mess of her joints, and by the time that she passed at the age of 78, she'd had numerous hand, feet, knee, neck, and hip surgeries to replace joints, fuse bones, and implant so much metal that when she walked through security, it was just like, beep, everything lit up. My Pentecostal grandfather always joked that he'd like to be next to her in the rapture because he wanted to see what stayed and what went. My grandma always longed for heaven, for that day when she would actually get back working hands and feet, and a body that didn't just scream with pain day in and day out. She firmly held to that hope. By his wounds we are healed. And having grown up in that same Pentecostal tradition, a lot of people that I know have this hope. Heaven's going to reverse it all. But in having my son and having people approach me about his need for healing, I began to wonder if there was good news in a story that said everything we deem imperfect in our bodies must necessarily be erased. It wasn't good news for me to think that my son could cease to be so much of who he was when he came into God's kingdom. That extra chromosome presents challenges. Trust me, it does. But the ways in which he engages the world teaches me a whole new way of seeing, being, thinking, and living. Why would I ever want that to go away? Now, with two entirely different ways of seeing God's victory for our bodies, is there a way to capture a good news story that embraces both? And I think it's here that we can turn to the disabled God. As Emmanuel, God took on the contingencies of human bodies experiencing the social exclusion that so often is a part of the disabled life. But Nancy Iceland pushes this further by suggesting that Jesus experienced disablement in his crucifixion, so that when he was resurrected, he didn't remove these impairments or marks from his body. Rather, she says, paradoxically, in the very act commonly understood as the transcendence of physical life, God has revealed as tangible, bearing this representation of body reshaped by injustice and sin, into the fullness of the Godhead. It was in the scars that remained post-resurrection that God was truly with us, being embodied as we are, incorporating the fullness of human contingency and ordinary life into God. And it was through these scars that the disciples' doubt turned to belief. For people with disabilities, this marks the good news story with a very real sense that disability does not contradict God or find itself at odds with God's kingdom. Iceland reminds us that the resurrection revealed the true meaning and significance of Jesus' earthly life, and that it was in the resurrected Jesus Christ that the disciples saw not the suffering servant from whom the last and most important word was tragedy and sin, but the disabled God who embodied both impaired hands and feet and side and Imago Dei. Disability does not exclude one from being God's image or experiencing resurrection life. So for my grandmother, who lived at such odds with her body, the disabled God is one who identified with her pains and did something about it. He was crushed, bruised, and disfigured so that her pains, both spiritual and physical, would be eliminated. Jesus' post-resurrection scars became her hope that one day she would carry scars and Imago Dei in a body that, like Jesus' body, was a new model of wholeness. For my son, whose very essence is so tightly bound up to his disability, Jesus' post-resurrection scars are my son's and our hope that he will one day retain his extra chromosome in a redeemed body that retains these Down syndrome scars and the Imago Dei in a way that, like Jesus' body, is a new model of wholeness. The good news story tells us that God created us with purpose, that God redeemed us through the marring of his son, and that we have eternal purposes that are now restored because of Jesus' work. And this includes disability from beginning to end. Jesus is disabled God. Well, maybe it will work. If you want to click it for me. Jesus is the disabled God. He provides us hope that our non-conventional bodies sometimes difficult. He provides us hope that our non-conventional and sometimes difficult bodies participate fully in the Imago Dei, and that God, whose nature is love and who is on the side of justice and solidarity, is touched by our experience. Our response is to place our hope in Jesus Christ, receiving the fullness of his life and resurrection that comes solely by means of his cross. Now, as we wrap this up, I want to make one final point. In each of our 4 examples of how to speak a disabled gospel message, it is impossible to separate this, if you want to click it, from how to live a disabled gospel message. Whether we are considering celebration, sin, lament, or hope, we cannot enter these conversations without first experiencing the nearness of disability. And I think I need to say this next bit, especially to those who consider themselves abled. We need to be present and involved with one another in deep, ways, learning from the many beautiful gifts and postures that people with disabilities have, so that our gospel becomes one of interdependent relationship rather than a charity mindset that makes evangelism this one-way trajectory from us to them, from the abled to the disabled. Hans Reindeers says pointedly that we don't share life with the disabled, particularly those who have an intellectual or developmental disability, because they are generally not seen as people we want to be present in our lives. And even more because we believe we don't need them. Sadly, as Ben Conner also notes, even the church, instead of imagining life together with people with intellectual disabilities and considering that our mutual encounter might result in changes in discipleship, ministry, and witness, Christians tend to follow the marginalizing approaches that Schreier describes as homogenizing, colonizing, demonizing, romanticizing, or pluralizing. We cannot speak a disabled gospel message if the only time we're engaging in the life of disabilities is when we're trying to save someone. Disability demands nearness, honesty, transparency, discomfort, rawness, dependence, interdependence, humility, and being okay with paradox. And until and unless we are willing to participate in relational life in these ways, we will have no platform or trust from which to speak the gospel. I'm going to click to the next slide. The beauty of seeing disability and embracing people with and without disabilities is that all of us become better people, able to see and experience God's kingdom in its fullness and as it was meant to be lived. In Jesus' kingdom, the weak, the lowly, and the humble are exalted. In Jesus' kingdom, value is found not in position, possessions, or power, but rather in postures, dispositions, and habits that exude love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. In Jesus' kingdom, we are each given gifts and callings which God knits together and calls us to use not for our own sake, but for the sake of one another. In Jesus' kingdom, we celebrate and value interdependence with one another and with God as we actually mirror our triune God and his relational wholeness. God's kingdom is an upside-down kingdom where there is a reevaluation of lives and bodies as we find ourselves and all of our weaknesses and shortcomings turned into strength because of what God does in and through our lives. And I think disability helps refocus everyone's perspective because disability requires intimate life on life, deliberate actions and commitments, and varied ways of seeing, hearing, speaking, experiencing, and engaging with the world. The essence of Christian life should be about life on life, speaking and living the gospel message through meaningful relationships and through our lives of goodness. We haven't always done this well, as we have promoted a passport out of this world while living lives that are not that much different from the world. It is in a disabled gospel message that we are brought to the heart of God's story and reminded of God's strength in our weakness, God's omnipotence in our limitation, God's life in our brokenness, God's perfection in our sinfulness, God's withness in our lament, and God's hope in our disablement. Last slide. God came near, and he calls us to come near. There is no other way to enter into disability, and there is no other way to live or speak a disabled gospel message. All right.
Thank you. So, in terms of evangelism and disability, what we focused on here was the evangel, the good news, right? And how do we understand this good news differently through the lens of disability? This morning, we participated in different practices, and we were reminded that all of us together In our baptism, we share a vocation, and this water extends to all of the homes and rocks that participated in this. A reminder, all these different rocks together, baptized in the same water, all called with a vocation, a calling, a ministry.